It's crazy to me, though, how much of what Solomon says is a reality in the world that we live in. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to examine three perspectives that will answer, I think, all questions that we have that, are pertaining to life. And our goal is to understand how we are to live in a loving biblical manner without compromising in light of all the chaos that is going on in our world today. Because as Christians, we have, I don't want to say we have a responsibility, but what I would say is we have the opportunity to live differently in the world that God placed us in. And so when we have this understanding of how we should live lovingly with a biblical manner without compromising, I think we are really getting close to what God would have. And so we're going to do that by trying to answer the question, does God matter in our perspectives, how we perceive things? And so what we're going to do in the first 8 verses, we're going to answer the question, does God matter in our perspectives of life's seasons? It doesn't take you very long to realize that life is full of seasons, right? We all have different seasons in life. And, when you've got the newborn season, right, that depended totally upon their mother. And then you get the toddler season where they're kind of unstable. And then you get the terrible twos and you're like, why did I have children, right? So we have different seasons in life. And Solomon is going to address those here. And he says this, and this is where you guys are probably going to want to sing. And I know, I thought about just playing the song instead of reading it, but I didn't. And so here we go, verse 1. To everything there is a season. You guys are already singing, aren't you? I mean, it's a given. But a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to gain and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to sow. A time to keep silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time of war and a time of peace. Seasons. That word means this. It means an appointed time. So in life, it's full of seasons. It's full of these appointed times in our lives. Well, what does the word time mean then? It means a point in time. So we have the appointed time in our seasons in life, but we also have in this timeline, we have a time which is at a specific point in that time. And each one of us has a specific point that we live in our timeline. And today's point is probably different than last week's point for our lives, right? Or that other season. And here's an example. You have a timeline. We have the day you're born and the day that you die. But every day is an appointed time from God. You see, God gives us these points in time to live life with the reality of eternity and with an eternal perspective and how God could use us today. Now here Solomon is, he's on this journey, and his desire is to figure out what's the meaning of life, to find happiness and grasp the meaning. And here he comes to this place, and I don't know if you get it, but as he kind of gives these things, there's a time, this kind of reoccurring theme of time. It just becomes kind of mundane. And really what he's saying is this: life is very predictable and boring. With all these times, and you read it, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck, it's like, man, life is just boring. Because all life is full of these times where there's life and then there's death. There's meaning and then there's no meaning. Now, this poetry describing the different seasons of life, it's so beautiful, to the point that it was even written into a song. And I don't believe Solomon got credit for the lyrics. I don't know. I'm not sure if he's getting a royalty check or not for it, but there it is. And people grasp it. Why? It's so beautiful. We can sing it. We remember it because it's so real to our lives, isn't it? We look at this and we're like, yes, I get that. I see what Solomon's saying. But what this poetry does is it casts a dark shadow, and it reminds us really of the troubles and evil and the relentlessness of life. Life isn't everything we hoped it would be, right? You see, what you sow is eventually reaped. What you build eventually falls apart, especially if JT lives in your house. You love, but it's often followed by hate. You have peace, but soon there will be war. I mean, if that isn't a description of the world we live in, I don't know what is. And it's what we're seeing today. And Solomon's conclusion was this: everything is futile, boring, mundane, and predictable. What a bummer life. Where's the thrill there? I like to try to figure solutions to the problems. And I realize that the problem with life is this: it's so daily. Have you ever noticed that? Life is like a daily occurrence. And our hope is this: there's got to be more to life than just what Solomon is saying here. You see, as followers of Jesus, we got to look at time differently. We got to look at life seasons differently. We need to recognize that God ordains our days, and that what we get is the opportunity to take full advantage of the time that God gives us to really further his kingdom and to love his people. And we do this by committing our seasons to Jesus, trusting that he will redeem our time. You see, oftentimes I think when we look at our time, we begin to feel guilty because we feel like I just didn't live my life to the fullest. I can't tell you how many older people, older than you guys, have told me the regrets they have in their life. I mean, we're talking way older than you guys, just so you know. I mean, like really, really old people. And I mean, you guys are young. I mean, it's just how it is. You don't have any regrets for your life, you know. I mean, but these older people really have these regrets. I could have done this. I should have done this. I wish I would have done this. Why didn't I do? Seems to be what fills their conversation when they look back at their life. But what we got to do is we got to trust Jesus, that even in those moments where we didn't make the best of the time and the seasons of our life, that God is a God that redeems those. Otherwise, what will happen is we'll just quit. We'll give up. We'll throw in the towel. We need to be reminded of what Paul said to the Ephesians in Ecclesiastes Chapter 5, verse 15 and 16. He says this: "See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil." There's the time that we live in, I think, is really described in that last part. The days are pretty evil. But we get to be a part of God's redemptive work in the evil times that we live in. You see, our life should be marked by this, not of us being the hero of the story, but of Jesus being the hero of the story. As we watch as he redeems my failures, that as he gives me the grace that I need to make it through this day, that I realize that he can use me to redeem people's lives for eternity. So even though the seasons may seem mundane, know this: there's a greater purpose for the times and seasons in your life. God has great value for you and the season that you're in. And he's got great value today for you. And he's got a great, opportunities ahead of you today on how you can make Jesus famous just by living your life. And so the second question we're going to ask answer in verses 9 through 15 is, does God matter in our perspective of eternity, right? Because if he cares about our times and our seasons now while we're alive, but what about eternity? How does that make a difference? And in verse 9, Solomon says this: "What profit has the worker from that which he labors? I have seen the God-given tasks with which the sons of men are to be occupied. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find the work that God does from beginning to end. I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it, that man should fear before him. That which has already been and what is to be has already been. And God requires an account of what is past. Kind of crazy. That last statement just kind of grips you, doesn't it? But it's fascinating to me to see how there's a glimpse of hope here in verse 11. You know, as Solomon's wrestling through everything, he makes this statement. He says that he has made everything beautiful in its time. So Solomon in his wrestling and his conclusion that life is pretty much meaningless and vanity, he says, but God is going to do something in his time. So Solomon asked the same question before, right? But this time he finds an answer in the tasks given by God to man. Solomon understood that God would make beautiful the good and the bad of the first 8 verses in its time. That there's a time that God will bring just this beauty in our lives. Solomon reminds us that we have an awareness and a longing for eternity. Right? What does he say here? He says he has put eternity in their hearts. God has put eternity in our hearts. He's given us the ability to perceive eternity and desire and long for eternity. Why? How? Well, by creating us in his image, in the internal image of our living God. Not internal, eternal. Right? We've been created in the image of an eternal God. And we need to remember that Solomon at this point is really in this backslidden state in his life, and that's how he comes to these conclusions of no hope and hopelessness and vanity. Having given his heart and his life to the Lord earlier on in his life, he is now influenced by all his wives and concubines, up to 1,000, which was forbidden in Deuteronomy. He was told not to do that. And what has happened at this point is these foreign wives and foreign concubines came in and began to introduce their idol worship, causing Solomon, this conflict. I've got these ladies in my life that I need to try to appease, and who gets the short end of the stick but God? You see, a life lived in sin, in disobedience to God's word, is a vain life. It's full of vanity. There will be no meaning in it because we were never created to live in such a manner. You see, he may have had the truth and understanding in his mind, but he was not living and walking or experiencing it at all at this point. And haven't we been there in our lives at one point or another? Where we know the truth, but the truth hasn't set us free. We know the truth, but we're choosing not to live in that truth. We know the truth, but maybe we're compromising that truth. But because God has placed eternity in our hearts, every person really has an understanding that we are eternal creations with an eternal destiny, and that our life has an eternal value and can make an eternal impact. Romans 1 says we may suppress the knowledge of this, which many do, but instinctively we know this because God has put eternity in our hearts. Guys, there's more to life than what we see. There's more to life than what we see. Eternity doesn't begin the moment you die. Have you ever thought about that? We're living in the reality of eternity right now. We can experience heaven on earth. Isn't that what Jesus said? Pray my kingdom come, my will be done where? On earth as it is in heaven. That's really saying this. God, bring eternity from heaven and have me live in the reality of that eternity today, that I may experience the fullness of heaven today. Why wait till you're dead to enjoy eternity? Think about that. I mean, it seems like such a simple question, but how many people do you know are waiting till they're dead to enjoy the fullness of heaven? When we can experience it today by walking with Jesus and allowing him to have the opportunity to show us the eternal perspective that we should be living in today. Verse 15 gives us insight into the reality and nature of eternity. Right? It says, that which has already been and what is to be has already been. It's kind of a tongue twister. I feel like Dr. Seuss would have written that. Right? That was my first thought. But what God is saying, or what Solomon is saying, right, is he's giving us insight of the reality and nature of eternity. He's saying, no past, no present, no future. That's what he's saying. In eternity, there's no past, no present, there's no future. It's all now. When God declared his name, he said this, I am who I am. He said, I'm the great I am. He didn't say I'm the great maybe, right? But he's the great I am. Not I was or I will be, but the I am. Meaning, I'm eternal and I'm now. And we can experience the eternal God today. In 1 John 1:5, we're told that God is light. Well, what does that mean? I want to suggest to you it means this, that as heaven is everything, or that in heaven everything is the present now. That there's no past and there's no future, but it's the now. And we can live in that reality today. That God is eternal. He's with us now. He's working in us now. He's with us, guiding us now and today. The conclusion that Solomon came to was God has given us a longing for and an awareness of eternity, but he has not revealed very much about his eternal work. And that we are to keep this yearning for eternity alive in our hearts. That's what we need to do. We need to yearn for eternity, giving us a yet to be fulfilled desire and longing for what God is doing. So when we go about our daily lives, we should say, God, I don't know how you're going to complete your eternal purpose today. I don't know what you're going to do in and through my life today to make that eternal impact, but I long for you to do that. And then when we look at life, it's not so mundane. It becomes exciting because what we begin to see is that we have now this longing for this eternal impact that God may use us to be a part of today. And then all of a sudden, everything has sense. I mean, times are boring and mundane, right? When things just seem to become repetitive, right? It's like some people think they live Groundhog's Day. Remember that movie? Over and over and over again? Like it's the same thing, just another day. But in God's time, what do we see? He makes everything beautiful and meaningful. We need to remember that it's he who began a good work in us that'll complete it. And God's still working today in our lives and through our lives. The last thing we're going to look at is, does God matter in our perspective of judgment? Now, judgment's a word that we don't like to talk about in church, right? People are like, oh, great, here he goes. It's hellfire and damnation. But we have to talk about judgment because there's a judgment that's going to come. The goal, though, is this. We don't want to just get knowledge about judgment so that we can tell those people who are going to experience the judgment that God's going to come and judge you. But what we need to get is an eternal perspective on judgment so that we see these people that we know are going to stand before the living God. And at this moment in their life, they're going to stand on their own merit, and God will judge them righteously and have our heart broken that we could share the hope and love of Jesus Christ with them, that we might be a piece that God uses in their journey, in their seasons, to bring about into their life an eternal reality of a God who loves them and is pursuing them. And so verses 16 through 22 we read this. Moreover, I saw under the sun, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. I said in my heart concerning the condition of the sons of men, God tests them, that they may see that they themselves are like animals. For what happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. One thing befalls them, and one dies. So dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and all return to the dust. Who knows the spirit of the sons of men, which goes upward, and the spirit of animals, which goes down to the earth? So I perceived that nothing is better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him? Talk about a discouraging statement. You're no better than animals. That's what Solomon's conclusion was. But we got to start with this judgment, because that's what made him really wrestle with this question and coming to this conclusion that this is who we are. The word judgment simply means justice. God's justice is going to come because he is a just God. And as a just God, he has to judge the world. If he didn't, he wouldn't be just. But Solomon looked at the world apart from eternity, and his perspective was this: it's simply full of evil. Instead of fair judgment, he found wickedness. Instead of righteousness, he found iniquity. And I believe if you are honest about the world that we live in, you would probably come to the same conclusion that Solomon did. God, where's your justice? Where's your righteousness? Right? Regardless of what political camp you are on, people see the same things from different perspectives. They're judging the same world, but they have different perspectives. And the problem of an under the sun living, S-U-N, sun that is that this is all there is, and that there's no eternity, and therefore we live hopeless lives. Because if there's no eternity, there's no judgment. If there's no judgment, why does it matter how I live my life under the sun? Why does it matter that I see things differently? And that's exactly where Solomon was. And depending on your perspective, it seems like the wicked and the evil win, and good and righteousness lose. And that's what we're seeing today. Regardless of where you are, or what side you're on, or what you feel we've lost, one group says, evil's winning and good is losing, and the other side, good is losing and evil's winning. But we don't live just simply under the S-U-N. Solomon hoped here that God would judge the righteous and the wicked, not only in this life, but also in eternity. He hoped that judgment would be a reality. Why? Because if there's judgment, then it gives meaning to the life that we live. And we have to give an account for it, and how we conduct ourselves really matters. But we as Christians need to live in the reality that there's a time where God will judge the deeds of man. The judgment is coming. So how do we live in light of this coming judgment? Solomon hoped it was coming. And he looked at humans and animals, compared their lives, compared their deaths, and with the under the sun, S-U-N, mindset, absent of eternity, his conclusion was there's little difference between human and animals. Both die and decompose. And if that's the case, you could understand why the world is the way that it is, because there is no hope that they are eternal creatures, that we're no different than animals. And if we're no different than animals, then why don't we just act like it? And I believe an accurate assessment of our world today is there's a bunch of people acting like animals. That's all they are. Bunch of people that says there's no eternal value to my life. I'm no different than the animal kingdom. So you know what? I'm going to live as if judgment isn't coming, and I'm just going to live my life for my glory, for my, goodness, and for my pleasure. And then when I die, and that's it. But the reality is, judgment is at the end. But what if we lived life today in the reality of God's judgment, rather than in a future thing where we said, like David said, God, search my heart and make it known and reveal to me if there's any wickedness in it? What if we woke up every morning and said, God, judge my life, show me through your word the things that are going to be harmful to me, the things that rob me of how you see me eternally. The things that keep me from seeing and perceiving people the way that you see them, so that I could love people like you love them at the end of the day. Solomon concluded that man has no advantage over animals in all his vanity. But then in verse 21, he asks, who knows the spirit of the sons of men? Good question. Which man's spirit goes upward, and the spirit of animals which goes down to the earth. He's saying, who knows the spirit of the sons of men and the animals? And we sense Solomon hoped that there was a different destiny for the two of them. Don't you sense that? God, please let there be something different. Yet in his under the sun thinking, there was no real reason to believe that anyone would know. And so he comes with this question, who knows? And since no one knows, he says a man should rejoice in his own works and his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him? What a depressing state. And his conclusion is based on the faulty assumption of that there's no meaning to live under the sun sun. There's no eternity. God doesn't matter. In his conclusion, nothing is better than for a man to accomplish what he can in this world and try the best he can, not to worry about what will happen after him. And don't we see that today? The news articles are full of it. Because death ends it all, life has no more significance or meaning than the life of an animal, leaving one to ask, who really knows if there's life or death? Which is a good question. But it's the answer to that question that reveals how we are to live and love in a biblical manner without compromising. The answer is simple. It's Jesus. It's Jesus. Jesus knows. You see, no guru can speak, no philosopher can teach, no scientist can state with authority where a man's spirit goes when he dies. Why? Because he hasn't been there yet. But Jesus has. Jesus has. Jesus alone came from heaven, so he can answer this question. And for the Christian, the question is not, is there a whale big enough to swallow a man? Though we like to ask that question. Or can the Genesis account be taken literally? We like to ask that question too. The question really always has been and always will be, what do you do with Jesus and his claims? And how do you live according to that? Because in Jesus we see that he took the judgment that we should have experienced, giving us hope that we will be with him one day. He took our judgment. In Jesus, we see all things are becoming new. In Jesus, we see that he is working all things for his good. In Jesus, we see that we are valued and loved. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. That's our hope. So as we look to Jesus, this is what we will see. To everything, there is a season. There's a time for every purpose under heaven. Jesus was born in a humble manner, and he died a sacrificial death. Jesus was planted and plucked up. Jesus was killed, but yet he brings our healing. Jesus was the temple that was broken down in order to build you and I up as his temple. Jesus wept over Jerusalem and Lazarus, and Jesus' weeping led to laughter and rejoicing. Jesus mourned as he dealt with sin, that he might dance with us as bride. Jesus was the stone that was cast away and rejected, that he might gather those who were scattered. Jesus on earth embraced our sin so that we could refrain from embracing them as we turn to Jesus. Jesus gained our life as a result of him losing his, giving you and I value. Jesus kept us the treasure and will one day throw away the world. Jesus tore the veil that he might sow and mend our lives. Jesus was silent in front of his accusers that he might speak, telling you that you are loved. Jesus is love, and he demonstrated that love when the world hated him, and he died for them. Jesus won the war over your life so that you and I would know that Jesus is our peace. So may we be those who have this mindset that Jesus' judgment is coming. Having an eternal perspective of the beautiful work that Jesus is doing today. As we use life seasons to love the people that Jesus brings into our life.